Nobody in Colby Ridge thought much of the boy dragging bent rebar and rusted gear housings out of the old scrap pile behind the Dutcher barn, not until the day he welded two tractor axles together in the middle of the equipment yard and the whole family had to stop and ask what exactly he thought he was building. Grady Dutcher was 15 years old, and by the middle of that August he'd hauled more junk out of the property's forgotten scrap pile than anyone had touched in over a decade: broken gearboxes, cracked hydraulic cylinders, a rusted-out grain auger nobody remembered the original purpose of, coils of stiff, sun-baked wire, and stacks of angle iron that had been sitting exposed to weather since before Grady was born. He didn't explain what any of it was for. He just kept hauling, and welding, and grinding, sparks flying off the shop's concrete floor most evenings until well past dark. If quiet ingenuity and real, hands-on work means something to you, subscribe and join us every week. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love knowing how far these stories travel. The Dutcher farm sat in the dry rolling country of eastern Colorado, 400 acres of wheat and sorghum that had supported the family for 3 generations, ground that demanded equipment be kept running through sheer stubbornness more often than money, because money for new machinery was the one thing the farm had never had much of. Grady's father, Wes Dutcher, ran the operation with the kind of grim, practical competence that came from 2 decades of nursing aging equipment through one more harvest than it had any business surviving, patching leaks with whatever was closest at hand, buying used parts from salvage yards 3 counties over rather than new parts from a dealer who'd charge triple. Grady's mother, Denise, kept the farm's books in a spreadsheet that had gotten harder to balance every year the equipment got older, tracking repair costs that climbed steadily against grain prices that mostly didn't. Grady had one older sister, Paisley, 17, who worked weekends at a diner in town and mostly regarded her brother's growing obsession with the scrap pile as something between embarrassing and mildly concerning. And there was Grady's grandfather, Emmett, 76, who'd farmed that same ground for over 4 decades before handing it to Wes, and who still spent most mornings in the equipment shed doing small repairs nobody asked him to do, more out of habit than necessity. It was Emmett who'd first taught Grady to weld, 3 summers earlier, patient in a way that surprised even Wes sometimes, walking his grandson through bead technique on scrap metal nobody cared about ruining, letting him fail dozens of times before the weld started coming out clean and consistent. By the time Grady was 15, he could lay a weld that Emmett himself admitted, grudgingly, was about as good as his own. The trouble that eventually explained the whole scrap pile project started that July, when the farm's primary grain auger, the machine responsible for loading harvested wheat from the combine into the storage bins, essential equipment that the entire harvest timeline depended on, failed catastrophically during a routine test run 2 weeks before harvest was scheduled to begin. The auger's main drive gearbox, a specialized, aging piece of equipment that had been patched and repaired more times than Wes could count, finally cracked its housing beyond any reasonable repair, the internal gears grinding themselves to metal shavings in a matter of seconds before Wes managed to kill the power. A replacement gearbox, new from a dealer, priced out at just under $9,000, money the Dutchers simply didn't have sitting available 2 weeks before harvest, not after a soft grain price year and an unexpected vet bill for a sick heifer that spring had already eaten into whatever reserve the family kept. A used replacement, sourced from a salvage yard, was cheaper but still ran close to $3,000, and the nearest salvage yard with a matching unit was in Nebraska, a state away, with no guarantee the part would even arrive in time. Wes spent 3 days making calls, running numbers with Denise at the kitchen table late into the evening, the two of them quiet and worried in the particular way people get when every available option costs money they don't have or takes time they don't have either. Grady listened to those conversations from the hallway the way he'd learned to do with most serious farm discussions, and it was during one of them, hearing his father read off the salvage yard's quoted price and delivery timeline, that something specific caught his attention. The salvage yard employee, according to Wes's frustrated retelling, had mentioned that the gearbox's actual failure point, a specific internal gear assembly, was a relatively standard industrial component used across several different types of agricultural and construction equipment, not some proprietary part unique to that one auger model. Grady thought about that detail for 2 days before he said anything to anyone. Then he went out to the scrap pile with a flashlight and a notepad, and started cataloging exactly what old equipment the farm actually had sitting back there, rusting, that might contain a similar-sized gear assembly. Here's what Grady began to understand over the following week, researching mechanical specifications with a focus that surprised even himself, cross-referencing gear ratios and shaft diameters using manufacturer manuals he found partly online and partly in a box of old equipment documentation Emmett had kept in the shop for decades without anyone bothering to look through it. The auger's failed gearbox needed a specific internal gear reduction ratio to function correctly, not an exact match necessarily, but something close enough that, combined with some custom fabricated housing and mounting work, could theoretically be adapted to fit. He found what he was looking for in the rusted-out grain auger nobody remembered the purpose of, a piece of equipment that had apparently belonged to Emmett's own father, sitting untouched in the scrap pile for well over 3 decades. Its gearbox, though badly corroded on the outside, had gears that, once Grady cracked the housing open with a rusted bolt and a lot of patience, turned out to be in remarkably good internal condition, protected from the worst of the weather by decades of dried, hardened grease that had sealed the mechanism almost like a preservative. The old gear assembly's mounting dimensions didn't match the failed auger's housing at all, different bolt patterns, a slightly different shaft diameter, an output orientation that was rotated almost 90 degrees from what the current system needed. Grady spent the better part of a week just measuring, sketching rough dimensions on graph paper with a ruler and a set of calipers Emmett dug out of an old toolbox, working out exactly what custom fabrication would be needed to make the old gear assembly physically fit into the space where the failed one had been. He started by cutting a completely new mounting plate from scrap steel plate he found leaning against the shop wall, using a cutting torch Emmett supervised closely for the first several cuts before trusting Grady to work it alone. The first plate came out warped from heat distortion, the steel bowing slightly as it cooled unevenly, forcing Grady to scrap it entirely and start over with a slower cutting technique, working in shorter passes and letting the metal cool between cuts rather than rushing straight through. The second attempt held its shape, but drilling the mounting bolt holes precisely enough to align with the auger's existing frame proved its own separate battle. Grady's first 2 attempts at drilling came out slightly off-center, close enough that a person might not notice looking at the plate alone but far enough off that the bolts wouldn't actually thread properly into the frame's existing holes. He redid the drilling a 3rd time, this time clamping a paper template he traced directly from the frame itself onto the steel plate before marking his drill points, a slower, more careful process that finally produced holes that lined up correctly. Adapting the shaft orientation meant fabricating a custom coupling piece to translate the old gearbox's output angle into something that would actually connect to the auger's existing drive shaft, a piece Grady had to design essentially from scratch, sketching 3 different versions before settling on one that seemed mechanically sound. He cut and welded the coupling from solid steel round stock, turning it down on the farm's old, rarely used metal lathe, a machine Emmett hadn't touched in years but still remembered how to operate, standing beside Grady through 2 full afternoons teaching him lathe operation from scratch, both of them covered in fine metal shavings by the time they finished. Emmett's hands guiding Grady's on the controls more than once when the cutting bits started chattering against the steel in a way that risked ruining the whole piece. The first welded coupling cracked under initial stress testing, a hairline fracture Grady found only because he'd developed the habit, working alongside Emmett for years, of checking every weld under bright light before trusting it with any real load. He ground the failed weld completely out and redid it, running a slower, more deliberate bead this time, adding reinforcing gussets at the stress points Emmett pointed out as the likely failure cause, small triangular plates welded at angles to distribute load more evenly across the joint. By the 2nd week of the project, with harvest now less than 5 days out, Grady had the adapted gearbox assembly roughly complete but hadn't yet tested it under any real load, working increasingly long hours in the shop after his regular farm chores, Wes stopping by more frequently now, watching with a mixture of skepticism and grudging curiosity but not yet fully believing the project would actually work. Wes didn't argue with that logic, mostly because there wasn't much to argue with. He helped Grady mount the completed assembly into the auger's housing that weekend, the 2 of them working together through a full Saturday, fitting bolts, checking alignment, adjusting the custom coupling's positioning by fractions of an inch until everything turned freely without binding. The first test run failed almost immediately. The moment Wes engaged the auger's drive under load, testing with a partial bin of last year's leftover wheat, a grinding vibration shook through the whole assembly, forcing him to shut it down within seconds. Grady traced the problem to the custom coupling, close, but not quite precisely centered on the drive shaft, creating a slight wobble that, under real load, translated into destructive vibration that could have destroyed the whole repair within minutes if allowed to continue. With 3 days left before harvest, Grady pulled the entire coupling assembly back off, remeasured everything twice with Emmett checking his numbers independently, and remachined the piece on the lathe a second time, cutting closer tolerances than his first attempt, working past midnight 2 nights running to get it done in time, his eyes burning with fatigue by the second night. Emmett bringing out a thermos of coffee and sitting with him in the shop past 11 both nights, not saying much. Just present. The second test, run the day before harvest was scheduled to begin, held. The auger ran smoothly under a full test load, no vibration, no grinding, the 40-year-old salvaged gears turning cleanly inside a housing Grady had built entirely from scrap steel and stubbornness. Harvest started on schedule. The repaired auger ran the entire 2-week harvest without a single failure, loading grain into the storage bins exactly as reliably as the original unit had before it failed, saving the family not just the $9,000 new part cost but the far more damaging cost of a delayed or interrupted harvest that could have meant losing crop to weather while waiting on a replacement part from out of state. Wes walked the equipment yard the evening harvest finished, standing beside the auger for a long moment, running a hand along the welded seams of the custom housing his son had built. "How much did this actually cost us, all told?" he asked. "Cutting discs, a few new bolts, some steel plate I didn't already have lying around," Grady said. "Maybe $200. Everything else was already sitting back there." Word of the repair spread through the small farming community the way most things did, mostly through casual mentions at the grain elevator during harvest delivery, and by that fall, 2 neighboring farmers had separately asked Grady to look at aging equipment of their own, wondering whether similar scrap-based fixes might save them the same kind of money he'd saved his own family. Emmett, watching all of this unfold from his usual spot in the shop that autumn, found himself thinking often about how much of what Grady had figured out was, in its own way, simply an extension of welding lessons Emmett had started teaching him 3 summers earlier without any particular endgame in mind, patient afternoons of practice beads on scrap metal that had, it turned out, been building towards something neither of them could have predicted at the time. "Wasn't teaching you to weld so you could save the harvest someday," Emmett told him one evening that fall, the 2 of them sitting in the shop after a day spent helping the neighbor with his own aging equipment. "Was just teaching you because it seemed like something worth knowing. Rest of it, you found on your own." Wendell Berry once wrote that the soil is the great connector of our lives, the source and destination of all. Grady hadn't set out that August to prove anything about scrap metal or salvaged equipment. He'd set out because $9,000 was money the family genuinely didn't have 2 weeks before harvest, and because a rusted, forgotten gearbox sitting in a scrap pile for 3 decades had felt, once he actually looked closely at it, like exactly the kind of problem worth trying to solve with his own 2 hands before simply accepting the family had no other option. Grady is 16 now. The repaired auger has run 2 full harvest seasons since that first frantic August, requiring only routine maintenance each time, nothing close to the kind of failure that started the whole project. He's already started a running inventory of the farm's entire scrap pile, cataloging what usable components might still be salvageable from equipment everyone else had long since written off as junk, treating the pile now less as forgotten waste and more as a resource nobody had bothered properly inventorying. Paisley, who'd mostly watched her brother's project with mild concern throughout its early weeks, has started bringing her own friends by occasionally to see what he's building, describing it to them, Denise noted once with quiet amusement, with something that sounded suspiciously like pride even though Paisley would never fully admit to it directly. "What's something in your own life that everyone dismissed as junk, that turned out to be worth more than anyone realized once somebody actually looked closely? Tell us in the comments, we read every one. And if stories like this one mean something to you, subscribe. We'd love to have you along.